Fight News Now continues, and want to remind everyone to go on to FightNetwork.com and be sure to download our Fight Network app for all the latest news happening in boxing, wrestling, and mixed martial arts. We've got videos, we've got podcasts, and of course you can follow us 24/7 on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. And coming up on Saturday, February the 27th, a big fight that will be airing here in Canada on Fight Network involving former middleweight champion Anderson Silva and Michael Bisping going down in a 5-round affair from the UK. A fight that years ago we were close to seeing. Essentially, had Michael Bisping been able to get that decision over Chael Sonnen, that fight probably would have happened. It didn't. We're getting it in 2016. And the fact that we are getting it these many years later, I think equal amount of questions Anderson Silva's way as much as Michael Bisping if he has the opportunity to win this fight.
Yeah, what I love about this fight, these are two proven competitors. Anderson Silva has not shied away from any of the top fighters ever at 185 pounds. Remember, after losing to Chris Weidman, he got back in the cage against Chris Weidman. He defeated Dan Henderson. He defeated Rich Franklin. He kicked Vitor Belfort in the face. We have to remember the things that Anderson Silva has done throughout his career. And for the most part, Anderson Silva has made it look easy. He embarrassed Forrest Griffin, a guy that defeated Quentin Rampage Jackson for the light heavyweight championship. He is... Many people cite Anderson Silva as the greatest fighter to ever step inside of the cage. And look at how many people ever did that to Rich Franklin. And again, I talk about what he did to Forrest Griffin. Just, he seems to be on a different level. But Michael Bisping seems to be on a different level as well. And people have seen him lose. They've seen him lose decisions. That fight against Chael Sonnen, I think, if I remember correctly, I had Michael Bisping winning that fight. But
many did.
Many people did. But Bisping's a competitor. He knows what's in front of him in Anderson Silva. He's going to have an awesome strategy to try to take out the 40-year-old. But will he be able to do it? Bisping, he gets hit. He gets hurt. But he has incredible will. And it's very difficult when you picture this fight in your mind to see anybody emerging victorious but Anderson Silva.
Yeah, I really, truly disagree. I really do, and there's a couple of key elements to this one. Picking fights is something we talk about a lot as being kind of folly. I mean, there's so much, the more you learn about fighting, the harder it is to choose fights. But what you can't do is picture Anderson Silva with Forrest Griffin and then picture Mike getting knocked out by Dan Henderson and put that together. That doesn't work. You have to think about the moments in time. Full disclosure, I used to play a troll game with Anderson Silva. He was the best fighter in the world. And people would ask for my picks, and I always said Anderson Silva was going to lose because I thought it was funny. But this time, I'm being serious, or am I? But I really do believe Michael Bisping is going to beat him. I really do, and here's why. When you look at how Bisping fights with solid fundamentals. Bisping fights intelligently, he fights a little bit at distance, and he's not mentally troubled by his opponents. He's not stressed out by them. He stays on the outside, watch as he exits after he strikes. He almost always backs out. That's modern fighting. The reason this guy that people have always underestimate him is because they didn't really understand that range. Everyone thought, oh, Michael Bisping, that's the guy I want to fight. People called him out forever, but he strikes out to distance. Very good at it. And I know you don't want to picture Mike at his best and Anderson at his worst, but at the same time, Anderson lost 2 in a row and then did not look good after coming back from an injured leg. So you need to project who's getting better, who's getting worse. And Anderson hasn't looked good since the first loss to Chris Weidman, which is a few years back now, and he's 40.
I know what you will say, but for the larger public out there, John, the casual fans, as you like to call them, if Anderson Silva comes out and he were to lose this fight to Michael Bisping in any fashion, and you couple that with the drug test, how much of a taint is this on his legacy? Is it one? Will people still look at this guy as one of the greatest ever, or will it always be those last 2 years I wish I could erase?
Well, it depends, because right now, with all the drug testing and everything, the sport is constantly being cleaned up. We have to look at, this was a part of the sport. You know, Anderson Silva may have popped, but there are many, many fighters that were on stuff that never popped, that were never tested. So it's just the landscape of things. And I don't think that takes away from the things that Anderson Silva has been able to do inside of the cage against some of the greatest fighters to ever compete in the game. And many of the greatest martial artists, some of the top fighters in the world, will still call Anderson Silva the greatest because of his timing, because of his movement, and the fact that he signed on the dotted line to face the who's who of MMA.
I agree. Anderson Silva should be considered one of the greatest of all time, my longtime troll job notwithstanding. He truly is one of the great fighters of his era. We always lump him in with George St-Pierre from that same era, that 3.0 era. Really, one of the golden ages of fighting. After you had Chuck and Randy, then you kind of transitioned into Anderson and George. George was a style of fighting that few could beat because he figured out the game to beat what you were good at. And it often involved getting in tight, putting on your back, and being physically, mentally, and technically dominant. Anderson did it on the outside, George did it on the inside, but those two of that era, at that time, were the greatest of all time. But the game changes so quickly that the new greatest of all time is always just around the corner because the game is always better than it was 5 years ago. The mid-level guy is always better than the mid-level guy 5 years ago.
And as we've seen with so many fighters, I mean, when you have a game that so much revolves around speed and timing, those are elements that disappear as you get older. I mean, power is typically the last thing to go. And I think that this fight, Michael Bisping, it's not like he's the youngest guy either. I mean, this is a guy that is as well. I mean, we're
taking
getting
damage as well.
Into the twilight of his career as well. I think from a competitive standpoint, the fact that's happening now, this becomes a much closer fight.
For sure.
Robin's outright picking Michael Bisping, which I don't know if that would have been the case 3 or 4 years ago.
Well, with my troll gig it would have been, but no, for real, like Michael Bisping right now is exactly the type of fighter that can beat if it's true, slowed down Anderson Silva that either fights more conservatively or a little crazier. You fight crazier, the technically proficient, intelligent fighter who is rough and tumble, but his fundamentals are strong is exactly the guy you want to put in there. And if you've got an Anderson who is being a little safer, then Mike at distance has the ways to beat him. We can't picture Anderson at his best versus Michael unconscious with Dan Henderson flying through the air. You can't picture the other side either, but you have to project who is slowing down at what time. But it's also a changing game, man. The best of all time discussion in 5 years will be totally different than it is today. I'm not saying Stephen Thompson is the best of all time, but you can see the way he beat Johnny Hendricks, how the game is changing dramatically. The Wonder Boy performance against Ellenberger and Hendricks might beat George St-Pierre of 5 years ago by keeping it out of the range of the wrestling and being able to fight on the outside, make a man chase, and then draw him in. If he stalls or backs up, you kick him. If he chases, you intercept him with the hands. And there's a lot of guys coming up like this. And whether it's in 3 years or 5 years, whether it's Dominic Cruz or whether it's somebody else, the greatest of all time, you'll take from that crop of guys would beat the greatest of all time from the last crop.
Yeah, you just have to look again at history. 1993 or 1994, many people thought that Hoist Gracie, this guy, was the greatest fighter of all time. He was in a tournament. And then a few years later, it was Kazushi Sakuraba. You ask the people now that consume mixed martial arts, they're like, who? Saka who?
And
John Jones. That's what it keeps. Further, there was Anderson Silva, and then it was George St-Pierre, and then it was Jose Aldo. We're having this conversation about Demetrius Johnson, and now Wonder Boy Thompson. In 5 years, the sport is going to continue to evolve, and we're going to see that next crop of guys that are inspired by both Stephen Thompson and George St-Pierre and are putting things together. So we're just going to continue to see an evolution of mixed martial arts.
Ask a guy in Ireland who the greatest of all time is. I think we got footage on this guy. But it's the same principle. Nobody can tell you that this guy is the greatest fighter of all time. Even if he finishes off and is a 2-division champion, no one's going to be ready to say that. But the way he's fighting at distance is innovative. It was what you beat a George St-Pierre with, what you beat a Chad Mendez with. It's the way you win that. Carlos Condit was doing it in his dominant rounds. Holly Holm did it against Ronda Rousey. Dominic Cruz was able to beat a guy who's very good at that game. This is the modern game, and this is the game that those former greats of all time would have to figure out how to beat now.
Final thing on Anderson Silva, as he's had this year to essentially train, do whatever, are you looking at new elements to add to your game or simply sharpen what you have? Do you expect anything different out of Anderson Silva?
It depends on his motivation. He's got a lot. Right now, he's got a ton of money. But the fact is, he's a martial artist. You would expect for him to want to evolve. Those 2 fights with Chris Weidman, they're out of the way. That whole situation with Nick Diaz and the drug test, that's out of the way. Get back and focus what you do best. and I think he's going to have a sensational performance against Bisping.
I think he's got the two main choices. One is minimize the menu and be more precise. The other one is that spirit of play that he's very good at and do a lot of different things. I truly believe Bisping is the right guy to face either of those.
It's coming up Saturday, February the 27th. Tune in at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll have a full preview show leading into the card from London, headlined by Anderson Silva and Michael Bisping, going down here on Fight Network in Canada.